everyone, I'm Amy. Today we will be talking about 赐死, or bestowed death. It was a unique form of capital punishment, kind of like a VIP service, where the emperor graciously allowed a high-ranking official, a relative, or a consort to take their own life. This system can be traced back to the early dynasties and lasted until the end of the Qin Dynasty in 1912. You may have seen the scene in a Chinese historical drama before, where an official looks hopelessly at a cup of wine with tears in his eyes and says, 君要臣死,臣不得不死. Which means if the ruler orders the subject to die, the subject must die. This may sound like extreme or even blind loyalty to us today. It is actually a reflection of the complicated web of obligations in the system of imperial China. In this framework of duty between ruler and subject, death wasn't always a simple sentence. Sometimes it was framed as a gift. And sometimes being gifted your own death was the only way to save your dignity, and more importantly, your family. Now, to understand why this was considered a privilege, we have to look at how a person was expected to die. In many periods, punishments for capital crimes were deliberately humiliating. These punishments were designed to be as ugly and public as possible. As portrayed in many C-dramas, the prisoner was often paraded through the streets in a cage, and the entire town would gather along the routes to throw vegetables at them, humiliating them in the last moments of their lives. And finally, they would be executed in a way that often mutilated the body. But for the nobility and other important people, the emperor offered a special alternative. Instead of a public scene, the emperor sent a messenger with one of three symbolic gifts. The first was the bestowed sword, 赐剑. This was the more ancient gift, which was mostly used before the Tang Dynasty. In ancient times, generals often used swords as a matter of personal honor, and in some cases, it also became an imperial gift, meant to deliver a lethal message. A famous case of this in history involves Fu Su, the eldest son of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. After the first emperor's death, a forged edict was sent to the crown prince, Fu Su, with the message that he should use the bestowed sword to end himself. At the time, a sword was a symbol of rank and imperial command, and receiving it with the edict meant the emperor was demanding a final act of obedience. At the time, his followers did suspect that the edict was forged and asked him not to follow blindly. But Fu Su was believed to be a very loyal son of Qin Shi Huang, so he chose the warrior's exit instead of the dishonor of questioning his father's gift. Interesting side note, many historians believe that if Fu Su actually succeeded Qin Shi Huang, the Qin dynasty would have lasted a lot longer than it did, and probably would have changed the entire Chinese history in a dramatic way. Now, the next two gifts are what we see more often starting from the Tang Dynasty. There was the poisoned wine, 毒酒. And if you're a C-drama fan, this is probably the most familiar one. It allowed the victim to die behind closed doors, usually in their own home or a private room in the palace. But what exactly was the poison wine? Well, legends sometimes describe this gift of wine as 鸩酒. That's a wine mixed with the venom of the zhen bird. It is said that the feather of this bird were so toxic that simply dipping it into a drink would make it lethal. But there is no physical evidence that the zhen bird ever actually existed. So what does that mean? So in reality, the poison wine was probably a cocktail of lethal herbs and minerals. Common ingredients would include aconite and arsenic. Also, it didn't have to be wine. It was simply poison in liquid form. In a game Road to Empress that I played recently, this was a common punishment that I came across: the deadly soup. You may have seen characters in dramas take a sip and drop dead instantly. But in ancient times, there was probably no such thing as a poison that killed the moment it touched their lips. Instead, it was actually a slow and painful process. The victim would suffer from internal burning, convulsions, and organ failure, and sometimes lasting for hours. it was private, yes, but it was rarely peaceful. And because this was ancient chemistry, not every gift was successful. Success depended on the dosage, the purity of the ingredients, and the victim's own blood type. Some historical accounts even describe recipients attempting to induce vomiting in hopes of surviving. But did they get to live if they survived? Are they off the hook? Not at all. Well, except for one interesting exception that I will cover later in this video. Just remember, the gift was wine, but the intended result was death. And there were always steps in place to ensure the intended result, regardless of the process. For example, imperial messengers might be waiting to confirm the result, and if the poison failed, these officials could step in to help the victim to finish the job. Now, we also need to distinguish between an execution and a palace murder. While we may often see the empress or empress dowagers sending poison in C-dramas, or even consorts poisoning each other, those acts were actually homicide. The gift of poisoned wine from an emperor was the same as an official execution, and completely legal. Anything else, unless it was issued under imperial authority or in the name of the emperor, was simply assassination or murder. The third gift, and perhaps most common in later dynasties, was the white silk, 白绫. This was a long strip of white cloth used for self-strangulation or hanging. A condemned noble wouldn't be marched to the public execution ground. Instead, a eunuch would arrive quietly at night, carrying an imperial edict and a folded length of white silk. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. The emperor was granting you the dignity of dying in private. A popular example is the death of Yang Guifei. She was one of the 4 beauties in Chinese history and a beautiful consort of Emperor Shenzong in the Tang Dynasty. During the Anlushan Rebellion, the emperor's own soldiers mutinied, blaming her for the disastrous state of the empire, and they demanded her death. And in order to address this mutiny, the emperor had no choice but to order Yang Guifei's death. It is said that he granted her the gift of the white silk and allowed her a bloodless end. So by now you might be wondering, why these 3 gifts specifically? That's because this was highly valued culturally. It ensured the victim could have a 全尸, which means having a whole body after death. In the Confucian mindset, preserving the body you were given by your parents was a final act of filial piety, whereas a public beheading was the ultimate disgrace. And every Chinese person back then took it very seriously. And even in modern days sometimes, people still value this. And on top of that, the white silk became the most common gift because it was also bloodless. In the eyes of the nobles and the imperial family, the gift wasn't about the act of dying. It was about the mercy of being allowed to die like a human being rather than an animal. But here is the strangest part. After receiving the order to die, the victim was expected to kneel, bow, and say 谢恩. That is to thank the emperor for his mercy. But why would anyone be grateful for a death sentence? So in imperial China, the emperor's word was the highest authority, which could override the normal judicial or sentencing process. When an emperor chose to bestow death, he was essentially offering a settlement. For many scholar officials, their reputation was more important than their lives. A standard execution was a humiliating social death. It was considered to be disgraceful and degrading. By contrast, receiving a bestowed death allowed the official to die with their status intact. That's why when a recipient knelt to say thanks, they weren't thanking the emperor for the gift. They were thanking him for allowing them to preserve their honor and the chance to save face. And being bestowed death was also a way to gild their legacy, because by dying quietly and obediently, they proved they were a loyal official to the very end. This created a strange dynamic where it seemed that some official almost dared the emperor to kill them. In the eyes of history, if they were executed like a common thief, they might be forgotten. But if they were bestowed death for speaking the truth, they would be remembered in history as martyrs of integrity. And then there was the protection of the family. Under the principle of 连坐 or collective responsibility, if a person's crime was really serious, it could lead to the execution of their entire household. But by accepting the gift and ending it themselves, the official was fulfilling his final duty to the throne. In exchange, the emperor could show mercy by not pursuing the rest of the family. Their lives might be spared, and in some cases, their property or even their titles could be inherited by their children. A famous example of this is Nian Yao, a legendary general under Emperor Yongzheng. He is the brother of the imperial noble consort Dun Su. She was famously depicted in the sea drama Empresses in the Palace as Nian Shilan, or Consort Hua. Nian Yao was incredibly powerful, but eventually his arrogance and influence threatened Emperor Yongzheng, and he was arrested and sentenced for execution. However, the emperor remembered their past friendships and his great contribution to the empire. So instead of a public trial, the emperor graciously bestowed death upon him in prison. And by accepting this, Nian Yao allowed the emperor to resolve this issue without a spectacle, and most of his family was exiled instead of executed. But it was a calculated gamble nevertheless. In another case, during the Tang Dynasty, Zhang Wuji was the brother-in-law of Emperor Taizong, and he was a brilliant chancellor who helped to build the Tang Dynasty empire. However, years later, he became a threat to the rising power of Empress Wu Zetian, and he was accused of treason and arrested. But because of his immense prestige and status, the court couldn't simply drag him to a public execution ground without causing a political scandal. So instead, he was exiled and then bestowed death in his place of banishment. By accepting the order to hang himself, Zhang Wuji allowed the imperial family to save face. In turn, he died in private, preserving the dignity of a man who had once been the highest official in the land. Unfortunately, though, in his case, the influence and power of the Zhang family was already too deeply embedded in the outer court, and Wu Zetian chose to eliminate most of his family anyways. So you see, in the end, eliminating any threat to the throne was always the top priority. So what happened if someone simply refused a gift? Could they just say no or run away? Well, the reality was that the choice was an illusion. Take the case of Wang Jia, a chancellor during the reign of Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty. When the emperor sent a message to bestow him a bowl of poison, Wang Jia didn't kneel or bow. Instead, he smashed the bowl to the ground, and he argued that if he was a criminal, he should be tried in a public court, not forced to die in private. But his defiance came at a terrible physical cost. Because he rejected the grace, he was stripped of his status and thrown into the imperial prison. He was then interrogated and abused, eventually dying after a 20-day hunger strike, vomiting blood in a dark cell. However, by refusing to die quietly, he forced his final testimony into the official record, naming the corrupt officials who were ruining the empire. After his death, the emperor was moved by his integrity and eventually followed his advice. Years later, Wang Jia's name was cleared, his son was given a noble title, and the court officially granted him the posthumous name Zhong, meaning loyal. By refusing the gift, he still had to die, but in turn gained an immortal reputation. However, when it comes to the imperial family members, things always tend to get a little bit more complicated. In the case of Emperor Wen of the Han Dynasty, when he wanted to get rid of his uncle, Bo Zhao, he didn't want to be known as a nephew who murdered his kin. So he discreetly sent a gift of poison, but Bo Zhao refused to take it. The emperor then sent a group of high-ranking officials to Bo Zhao's house to drink with him all day, politely urging him to drink the poison. And when that didn't work, the emperor sent the officials back, dressed in white funeral robes. They stood outside Bo Zhao's residence and started crying as if he had already passed. This was so shameful to Bo Zhao and his family that he finally gave in and took the poison just to make the public humiliation stop. And then there were even more defiant cases like Empress Feng of the Northern Wei. When the messengers arrived with her gift of death, she screamed and ran, claiming the emperor would never kill her. The officials didn't argue. They simply assisted her. They held her down by force and poured the poison down her throat. As you can see by now, this was not a gift that could be refused. In the end, the result was always the same. So if the emperor wanted you gone, you were gone. But was there ever a way to escape a bestowed death? Well, the truth is, running away and hiding was never an option. If you fled, the government would issue a nationwide bounty. Once you're caught, you wouldn't get a gift anymore. You would get the most brutal punishment possible. And your family would pay the price for your shameful behavior. However, there was an interesting story where the gift was survived. This brings us to the story of Jia Zhiyan from the Tang Dynasty. When his father was gifted poison, Jia Zhiyan knew that he couldn't stop the emperor's will. So he asked the guards for a final favor. Let his father pray to the gods of the four directions before he drank it. While his father was distracted by prayer, Jia Zhiyan grabbed the cup and drank the poison himself. This was an act of ultimate filial piety. But miraculously, he didn't die. Some say the poison was weak. Others say he vomited out. However, when the emperor heard of Jia Zhiyan's noble sacrifice and incredible survival, he was deeply moved and decided to revoke the gift. And the father and son were exiled together instead. But stories like this are the exception that proves the rule. For everyone else, the gift was a final, unavoidable command. In a previous video, I also went over the ancient Chinese practice of xunzang, or accompanying burial. In some early dynasties, when an emperor died, it was sometimes expected for his favorite concubines, servants, or even some officials to follow him into the afterlife to serve him. While xunzang was a ritual sacrifice and not usually framed as a punishment for a crime, the methods could be similar. Whether an official was being punished for treason, or a consort was being honored to follow her late husband, they were both handed the same cup of poison or the same strip of white silk. In some of the most horrible cases, a consort or servant could even be buried alive as a part of the xunzang. It was a final act of duty to the emperor. Sometimes, when a powerful consort was ordered to follow the emperor in death under the ritual practice of xunzang, it could be presented as a bestowed death. This was a way for the dying emperor to remove potential rivals or eliminate anyone who might cause trouble before passing power. For example, in many of these situations, a powerful consort had a young son who was the crown prince, and she would likely influence his actions during his rule. By gifting her death as a part of xunzang, the emperor was making sure that she wouldn't be around to meddle after he was gone, while at the same time assuring her that her son would safely become the next emperor. In the end, the system of bestowed death shows us a world where even your own life was considered the property of the emperor. Sometimes the kindest thing the tiger could do was to let you choose how you left the room. That's it for today's video. If you enjoyed today's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.